I'm Tracy Sulkin. As the Dean of the College of Media at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the 2020 Ebert Symposium series and our discourse on the film and media industries. Today's panel, Documentary Film and Social Change, is moderated by Associate Professor Angela J. Aguayo of our Department of Media and Cinema Studies. Dr. Aguayo is a scholar and media maker specializing in participatory and engaged cinema. She is an award-winning writer, director, and producer of documentary shorts utilized in community engagement campaigns, and her work is screened at festivals and museums around the world. Her most recent book, Documentary Resistance, Social Change, and Participatory Media, investigates the political impact and democratic possibilities of engaged media practice.
Welcome to the Ebert Symposium and our spotlight panel on documentary and social change. Documentary film, with its status as high art and its ability to creatively reimagine linear depictions of time and causality, offers audiences and filmmakers new opportunities to visualize themselves and their futures. The history of documentary and social change in the United States is a story of people unwilling to give up on their idea of an inclusive democracy, using the tools of media production to demand recognition and justice for the most vulnerable among us. The consistent thread between our panelists today is the skillful manner in which they produce critically accomplished filmmaking that creates possibilities for cultural influence and social change. Not all documentary filmmaking takes on this civic function of social transformation, as these waters are often unstable and difficult to manage. I'm thrilled that we are talking to some of the leading forces in this manner of documentary production. We'll be talking with Dawn Porter, an award-winning documentary filmmaker whose work has appeared on HBO, PBS, Discovery, and Netflix, among others. Her most recent works, John Lewis, Good Trouble, for CNN Films, explored late Congressman John Lewis's pivotal role in the civil rights movement. And The Way I See It is about photojournalist Pete Souza, who served as the chief official White House photographer for President Barack Obama. As a two-time Sundance Film Festival director, her film Trapped, which explores laws regulating abortion clinics in the South, won a special jury prize for social impact in the 2016 festival. In addition to a Peabody and numerous awards, Gideon's Army on HBO won Best Editing at Sundance. She also directed and produced Spies of Mississippi, a critically acclaimed historical documentary that was part of the Independent Lens series on PBS, as well as Rise, The Promise of My Brother's Keeper, a film for the Discovery Channel's chronicling of President Obama's program to help men of color succeed. She is currently directing and executive producing an Apple TV multi-part documentary series with Oprah Winfrey and Prince Henry, which focuses on both mental illness and mental well-being. Sasha Jenkins is a native New Yorker who recently directed Wu-Tang Clan of Mics and Men, premiering at Sundance and released on Showtime. At Sundance, Jenkins also premiered Railroad Ties, a short film that tackles the intersection between underground railroad movement that liberated African Americans during slavery. Jenkins' first feature-length documentary, Fresh Dressed, also premiered at the 2015 Sundance, as well as his next film with the best title of all time, Burn, Motherfucker, Burn, about the generations of African Americans who have been abused by LAPD. Jenkins has built his strong reputation as a television producer via shows like the Cartoon Network's The Boondocks and VHS's The White Rapper Show. Jenkins also co-founded the music journal Ego Trip and Beatdown, the first ever hip-hop newspaper, and spent several years at Vibe magazine. And finally, Kirby Dick is a two-time Emmy Award-winning and two-time Academy Award-nominated filmmaker behind the most groundbreaking documentaries today, and with his creative partner, Amy Ziri. The Oscar-nominated film, The Invisible War, broke the story of the epidemic of rape in the U.S. military and led to 5 congressional hearings and the passing of 35 reforms through Congress. Their follow-up, The Hunting Ground, about campus sexual assault ignited a national discussion and led to sweeping policy changes at hundreds of schools. Their most recent film, On the Record, now streaming on HBO Max, follows a music executive as she faces her decision to become one of the first women of color to come forward as part of the Me Too movement. Additionally, I have 2 fellow moderators and panelists, Jay Rosenstein and Allison Davis from the University of Illinois. Jay Rosenstein is a Center for Advanced Study Professor of Media and Cinema Studies. He is a Peabody and Emmy Award-winning independent documentary writer, producer, director, and editor whose documentaries have been seen on the national PBS series POV and Independent Lens. Rosenstein is the recipient of the 2010 Peabody Award for his documentary, The Lord Is Not on Trial Here Today, about the landmark First Amendment case that started the separation between church and state and public schools. The documentary also received 2 Emmy Awards. His best known documentary, The Groundbreaking in Whose Honor American Indian Mascots in Sport, has directly led to the elimination of American Indian mascot nicknames and logos at schools at every national level. Allison Davis is a lecturer in journalism with the College of Media. She has been producing national documentaries for over 2 decades. Her programs have received numerous awards, including several regional Emmy Awards and over 20 Emmy nominations. Davis produced documentaries for the Big Ten Network, but before that, she worked at WIL-TV PBS, where she was a longtime producer and host of Prairie Fire, a cultural magazine series about the people and places of Central Illinois. I want to begin today by talking about the balance between accomplished filmmaking and the challenging of conventional thinking. But before we get into that, I wanted to ask our panelists if they could talk briefly about how and why did you come to learn about the process of documentary filmmaking? And why do you choose this work over other professions?
Well, I was a journalist for many years, but before that, my father, Horace Jenkins, was a documentary filmmaker. And actually, last film that he made before he left the planet, Cane River, was lost for nearly 40 years. And actually, our friends at Ebert Fest had a heavy hand in bringing that back to the world. So I was raised by a documentary filmmaking father, and my mom, she hailed from Haiti and she was a painter. And I think documentary film is the perfect combination of journalism and art. And always looking at Life magazine as a kid, looking at the photographs and, being taught early on that culture is a premium and culture is a big part of your identity. And knowing firsthand that there aren't a lot of people like me who always have the opportunity to tell our own stories, I figured, starting out at a young age, publishing my own magazines. I started out publishing a graffiti zine back in the 80s, and then I launched a hip hop newspaper. I realized that having a hand in telling my own story was very important. And so, I continued on with journalism and then crossed over into television and filmmaking. But to me, we're in a world where there's this whole idea of fake news and, journalism is under attack, but it's one of the most important facets of our society. And I had the great privilege of understanding that at a young age directly from my family.
I just want to, I think she made a very interesting observation that documentary is a combination of journalism and art. And I think that is one of the things that certainly fascinated me. I started out in going to art school. I was at California Institute of the Arts, and which was actually a great education for me. And I sort of naively thought, well, I'm in Los Angeles, I can just very easily move into Hollywood. That actually was a real wake-up call for me. And I thought, well, yeah, I can get into directing films by making a documentary. I made a documentary and fell in love with it and decided I really didn't want to make fiction films at all, but I really wanted to stay in documentary. And one of the things that I find really interesting about documentary and actually documentary filmmakers is that so many people are so self-taught. I mean, and that, I think is very similar to my experience with artists. I mean, there's this quality of continual exploration, of not following any kind of guidelines, or you just continually explore. And that's what I just find always thrilling about documentary filmmaking, is every time you go into a new film, it is, you're going into a situation where you've never been before. You're interacting with people who you've never interacted with before. There are guidelines, certainly there are best practices, but you're also inventing them with each film. And I find that so similar to art and art making.
I loved that. And my father was a photographer. And so, we used to make Super 8 films when I was small. Like some people do sports with their parents. Like that's what we did. We made Super 8 films. And then I became a lawyer. So I really respond to what both Sasha is saying and what Kirby is saying about, so I didn't go to film school. I went to law school. But I was a litigator. So the job of a litigator is to take something complicated and make it comprehensible. And then I could add, so I had this love of photography and I really liked photographing people. That was always my favorite, kind of subject. And then I realized you could make the people talk, like if you did documentary. But there also was a very strong, pull for me in what Sasha is speaking to in the not seeing a lot of people who look like me telling stories. And so when I started, reality TV was getting really popular, but it was getting less real. And, there were a lot of caricatures of people, which I thought was just crazy because people are so infinitely fascinating if you just listen to them. But I think, the what the TV people realized was maybe you need a little more time than the 13 weeks of filming, in order to find a nuanced story. And so it didn't work for TV. But I do think what the reality kind of boom did was amplify the appetite for nonfiction and from hearing for real people. So all of those things kind of combined for me to step in and say, well, why can't I do this too?
I recently finished a book called Documentary Resistance, where I went around the country talking to filmmakers and activists and funders and critics about how they understood documentary functioning in the process of social change. And one of the strange things that I encountered was that there was this real uncomfortable feeling that arose when I asked filmmakers, do you do activist work? Are you a filmmaker? And there was this tension between art and social change. And then in my own production work, I've noticed that sometimes my position as someone who's interested in social change doesn't always correlate with my position as a director, that those decisions I'd make as a director are different than those I'd make as an activist. So my question to you all is, do you run into this tension where you have to navigate like your ambitions towards creating new representations and social transformation and a different vision than the things you've seen before, and the expectations that are placed on you as someone who is making creative work that's accomplished and received critically by your industry?
Well, for me, it just boils down to the authenticity. As long as what I'm doing is authentic, that's the best possible representation. I don't have to try. I don't have to, because I feel like I have to answer to people, right? I have to answer to people in my community. I have to answer to people who look like me. And even if it's something that they don't all agree with, or they're not all the way happy with the portrayal, as long as there's a level of balance, and you can present a level of balance where everyone might not agree, but they can see that there was great care that went into it, great thought that went into it. To me, that's my job. For instance, with this Wu-Tang series, I'm about the same age as these guys. We kind of came up in New York in similar ways. I grew up in Queens. They grew up in Staten Island. I knew nothing about Staten Island at all. But if you know anything about Wu-Tang, their music, it sounds like it came from the Galapagos Islands in terms of sonically what was happening with hip hop at the time. And so when you go and you unpack Staten Island and you understand how strange and racist and how bizarre and what their environment was like, you really have a better understanding of why their music was so outstanding and different from everywhere else. Because their music, in my opinion, with people of color in America, their art is always a reflection of and a reaction to the environment. So my goal with Wu-Tang was to make a film that was a reflection of and a reaction to the environment and an exploration of the environment. And so I'm not saying music was secondary, but so many people have written about hip hop or have made films about hip hop, but it's like how do you explain why so many people in Poland love Wu-Tang? And I'm in Queens and I don't understand everything they're saying. How is it that these people know every word? And it boils down to, even if you don't fully understand Wu-Tang, there's a level of authenticity that is universal. And if you go into these subjects without understanding that authenticity and that touch, and you make something that is out of step, people will recognize. And I always have to start with the core constituency, which are people who look like me. And as long as I feel like I've done a thorough job journalistically and I've created balance, that's my benchmark for whether or not I'm representing, or, will social change come out of what I'm doing? I think understanding will come out of what I'm doing, and maybe some change. But I feel like as long as I'm working as a representative and a translator, and I'm bridging ideas together in ways that haven't been bridged because I'm native to it, then maybe more people can learn and maybe there will be change. Of course, I would love it if there was change, but I don't necessarily go into these projects thinking I'm going to make change. The only change I'm making is there's someone like me behind the camera telling the story. That's the real change.
Yeah, I really respond to that. I feel like I don't describe myself as an activist because I'm not, but also because I think that would detract from the people who make it their life's work to select an agenda and they study it and they this is what they do day in and day out. And that's, for most of us, that's not what we do. That's not what we're trying to do. So I'm very happy if the activists want to use my work for their work. But it's, I completely agree. Like, part of if there's any activism is in choosing your subject and in doing your initial research and saying, what do I have to say about this topic? What do I have to add? What can I highlight? But there's beauty in the messy truth. And so, I think that is what I kind of aim for.
One small thing that I'll add very quickly, the film that I made, Burn Motherfucker Burn, why did I choose that title? So many people wonder why are they destroying their own communities? Why are they doing this? So I went as far back as the so-called, loud New York City streets. I went as far back as the so-called Watts riots of '65, and juxtapose that with stuff that happened 25 years later. And what was the difference? It was police abuses then and police abuses now. And so human beings get to a point where they're just so angry. And I wanted people to understand why people felt like they had to say, in the 60s, it was burn, baby, burn. And by the 80s and 90s, it was burn, motherfucker, burn, because people were just sick and tired. And I wanted people to connect and understand that feeling. I wanted people to watch the film, no matter who you were and where you were from, and understand why Black folks in Los Angeles felt that way.
Sometimes there is this way in which documentary has the capacity to place things on the political landscape for reevaluation that has profound political influence, even if you don't intend it. In fact, I think intention doesn't matter. There have been tons of films that have made change when they never even really began to even start it out in that way.
One last thing I'll say. So I interviewed the chief of police in Los Angeles for that film, and they had to know some of the questions, but I went off the cuff. And then my last question was like, let me ask you a question. If you were me, how would you feel about the police? And it totally threw him off guard. And he said, well, when I first joined the force, I had long hair. So I would get pulled over all the time. And I didn't stop him from saying that, but he was trying to equate being a long-haired hippie, maybe an undercover cop, being pulled over all the time. He was trying to, relate to me, I guess. And it was a very awkward exchange. And I didn't stop him. I let him speak his piece. He was a nice enough man. But it was extremely awkward, and he retired not soon after that film aired. So not taking credit for that, but it was an interesting exchange.
I think it's a very interesting question. I mean, there's definitely a tension between, the activists that are our subjects and documentary filmmakers. I mean, activists are a handful. and they should be. I mean, if they weren't, they wouldn't get their job done. But I also think there's an incredible collaboration. I mean, I think activists are undervalued in society. I think Black Lives Matter has started to help change that perception, but I mean, I view them, I mean, they're not artists, but I view them on the same stature as artists. I mean, they're out there completely on their own, you know, incredibly ambitious, trying to invent something. And that's a creative process. That creativity is very informative to me as a filmmaker. I mean, I find a lot of times where they have ideas of what to shoot that I would never come up with, and very inventive ideas, not just, oh, cover that, but you know, you could actually arc this whole little section like this. And that back and forth dialogue is really important. Of course, I mean, we have, but that's one of the reasons I love working with activists, because they're so passionate. I mean, most activists, I mean, almost all acts, I think, I mean, you can call them up at 11:30 at night and say, hey, I got this idea, and they're there. And I mean, that actually makes filmmaking a lot of fun, as well as very meaningful.
Yeah, I think too, and also always reminding you to challenge convention. You know, like that's to me, like what the best activists are doing is they're always asking the why. And, you know, a lot of times, like, we're trying to get something done and you forget about the why, and the why is often like the heart of the matter. So it, like, I love working with the passionate activist people, you know, and just reminding myself that there's a purpose to this art, you know, that there is a purpose to it. Even if you're just trying to explain it, explain what they're trying to do, or amplify, you know, what their process is.
Yeah, we're very well socialized into the commercial and industry aspects of documentary production, but the community and civic functions, which actually precede the commercial and industry functions, have been going on for a century, are like rich practices that I see threaded through all of your films, not just maybe even in who you're talking to, who you're asking questions to, what you're focusing on, but then how it circulates and how it has a life of its own post, you know, you're letting it go into the world. And I think Kirby has some really interesting examples of how this happens in very disparate ways. Like, even if you want it to happen, it doesn't mean it's gonna necessarily flow in the ways that you want it to. In regard to, we were talking about the sequence between how, you know, the hunting ground and the invisible were received really differently by the institutions you were trying to have a conversation with.
Yeah, that is true. I do want to say, I just want to go back to activists, because I kind of want to stay on the love of activists for a while, because they put you through the ringer. I mean, I've experienced this, you know, on many of my films, all the way through the process, but certainly the first 6 months for me is such an educational process. No matter how much I know about the subject, I don't know anywhere near as much as they do. And their constant challenging in a very intense sort of way is really, in some ways, helps to form or forge the theoretical basis of the film. And so what you're seeing, and I look for those kind of people, because what you're seeing, you know, it's attributed to the directors, it's attributed to the filmmakers, but it should also be attributed to those activists as well. So, no, it's totally true. Just very briefly, I mean, films can be received so differently. I mean, The Invisible War. I mean, we were very strategic with that film. We made it entirely nonpartisan or bipartisan. We were very careful to put, you know, the same amount of Republicans as Democrats in the film, even though it's a, you know, very feminist film. We weren't using any of the language of feminism. We did put the misogyny in for that reason, because and the third thing we did is we didn't make it anti-military. And that, of course, that we got from our subjects. I mean, our subjects, even though they'd been, you know, horribly raped and then their rapes have covered up by the military, they still love the military. And that was one of the educational aspects of making this film, was to view the idealism of these people who did into the military, this love of service of country. And so we put, on their guidance, really, we put that in the film as well. And I think that allowed the film to land in a way that it seemed like it didn't have an agenda. I mean, we had a very clear point of view, but, and I think it caught people off guard. I think by the time The Hunting Ground came around, there was more of a there was much more of a reactionary aspect happening in the country, especially around issues of women's rights. It had started to ramp up. I mean, Gamergate came shortly after. The University of Virginia, that whole reporting, the problematic reporting, fired up people, and we were going more into a battle that was starting to be fought. And of course, then when you focus on individual institutions, that they were extremely defensive. It was surprising that some of the most liberal institutions were the most defensive, like not only Harvard Law, but also Berkeley was the most reactionary university in the UC system. Excuse me. So yeah, I mean, you certainly saw a range of responses.
In the span of your career, what moment or scene or topic did you document that you felt had profound consequences? And it doesn't have to be consequences in a grand scope, but like consequences for the people there, or the documentary, or when you circulate or whatever. Can you think of a moment, or that moment where you captured something and you realized, wow, I had really captured something incredibly authentic that was going to translate into a kind of a transformation moment for people watching it?
In my film Burn, it's like the closing moment where I was interviewing this expert on gang culture in Los Angeles, and he brought his son along with him, and we started talking about police and police searching your car and getting pulled over. And we're talking about it, and he's like, I got to tell my son this, and he's 13. He's like, hold on a second. He called his son over and he says, what did I tell you about the police? And his son is like this cute, sweet, innocent kid who's not looking in the camera and just very, numbly repeating what his father instructed him to say if the police came. And that moment, for a lot of parents and a lot of people in general, was something that really connected, and really it made you see that, the innocence of, these young men, they're often described as men when they're actually boys. And the things that you as a father have to tell your boy in order to survive, that really seemingly resonated with a lot of people.
Yeah, I would, well, first of all, I have two sons, and I overheard my 13-year-old tell his 11-year-old brother a version of the talk. And his version was, if you get in trouble with the police, stay alive till I can get dad there. So it wasn't as comforting or subtle or elegant, but it probably made the biggest impression on my 11-year-old child that his brother was giving the talk. But for film, I think there's two things I can think of. One is in Trapped, the film about the abortion providers. The last interview I did with Dr. Parker, who's an African-American abortion provider, provides in the South. He mentioned that he didn't wear a vest. And, so he said that, he told it to me, it was open camera. This was literally our last interview after filming for several years. I knew he knew what he was saying. We're in finishing, and Colorado happens, a Planned Parenthood clinic, a gunman walked in and killed several people in a Colorado clinic. And I just was in a panic, called Dr. Parker and said, you told me you don't wear a vest. You want me to take that out? We're locked, but I can go back in. This feels really irresponsible. This is about to come out. And he said, they shot Dr. Tiller in the head in church. A vest is not going to protect me, and I don't live my life. He said, I knew exactly what I was saying. And I want people to know that I understand that I can't necessarily stay safe. And so that was one thing. And then the second thing that happened just recently is in the film The Way I See It, we interviewed a father, David Wheeler, whose son Ben was murdered at Sandy Hook. And he, this is many years ago now, and he just talked about the importance of President Obama coming to comfort his family. And, just for him, I felt like I'm making this man relive the worst day of his life again. But he wanted to talk about how the President of the United States coming and listening to his family, to his 9-year-old son who had heard his younger brother be killed, was incredibly meaningful to their family. And in a way, that when you say empathy matters by leaders, it's a lot different than him saying, my son was killed by a mad gunman and the President of the United States hugged my wife and comforted my 9-year-old. So those two things were really, people are really responding to that interview. And, also like the other piece of this is we're grateful to these subjects for sharing these stories because they don't have to.
For me, I would say essentially my whole career has been built around one interview. And that is an interview that I did with a Native American woman, artist, activist by the name of Charlene Teeters, who has become one of the leading voices in the movement to get rid of American Indian mascots in sports. And this goes back now to 1995. And in fact, the whole film that I made, which really tells her story called In Whose Honor, was based around my hearing her give a talk a few years prior and just having my eyes open and my mind blown about what a Native person's reaction is to these kind of mascots, since I had never heard it before. And from the very beginning, I would say my one and only goal in that film was just so that more people could hear her story. I was so moved by her story, and I was so naive as well that I thought, well, once the rest of the world hears her story, these mascots are going to disappear, which was how many years? 35 years ago. And so I sat down and interviewed her, and she was just as compelling to me when I talked to her as she was then. And and essentially the power of the whole film is just based on that. It's based on her individual charisma and her ability to express herself that way. So just hearing her say those words, I had to keep reassuring myself, just don't get in the way too much, Jay. Just while I was editing, just make sure you let her get her story out. Make sure you let her get her story out. This is what it's all about. And then from the other side, I would say from the sort of impact side, I think when I was offered a job here at the University of Illinois, and 3 of the 9 members of the Board of Trustees voted against my being hired, which I'm the only person, I think, in Illinois history to have had board members vote against them and still get hired. That's when I knew that my film had made some impact.
I was just, a moment that I had was, I did a documentary about Manny Jackson, who was the first African-American player on our Illinois basketball team back in the 60s. And he was a high school basketball star down in Edwardsville, Illinois, Southern Illinois. And we went back down to Edwardsville, and he wanted to, he had been kept in touch with all his high school teammates. And he and the one other guy, Governor Vaughn, were the only Black guys on their high school basketball team. And the town loved them, cheered them on, all followed them to the state tournament in Champaign. And he still had these great relationships with his teammates. And we went down, he was having a get together with them. And then out of the blue, he really decided to confront them about when he was in high school and they would win all these games and they'd go to the restaurant to celebrate. And he and Governor weren't allowed to sit in the restaurant. They sat in the kitchen, and none of the teammates came in and talked to them or shared that victory with them. And that was just a really surprising moment for us. And I felt so glad that he had that opportunity to talk to them and they had a chance to share their memories. And it was he mentioned it when we screened the film that it was really healing for him, and how if he peeled back, he always has this scar there, and it was a good way for him to bring that out to his teammates. So I was very thankful for that. But one thing I love about all of your films is the mastery that you show when you're interviewing, whether it's Drew Dixon or John Lewis or Nas, that I see that connection that you build with them, that trust. And I would love to hear a little bit of your insight on how you build those relationships with your subjects when you're doing the interviews.
Well, that's the number one thing. I mean, I equate it to Christmas time. Me and my mom and my sister and my parents split up. We were living in DC and we moved to Queens, and my dad moved to Harlem. And in Queens, I had a whole other set of cousins that I didn't really know that well. And I'll never forget, there's the big table with the adults, and then I had a table in my room, and it was me and my cousins. And I had to get to know these people. And so I had to entertain, I had to try to connect with them. And so that's how I go into every interview. It's kind of like, you're my cousin that I don't know. How do I find a way in? And to me, the secret sauce is listening. I see so many people, and I know this from journalism, they go in with a set of questions. What's your favorite hamburger? I love this hamburger. Okay, next question. Like, if my answer is I love hamburgers that are magenta, then that's going to open up another door that I'm going to go down. And so when your subject understands that you're listening and you're interested in them, that's how you sort of, this is the cliff notes, but like, this is how you build trust, by actually paying attention and being interested. And someone said during this panel that everyone's infinitely interesting in one way or another. And I agree. I think everyone has an interesting backstory. How did your parents come together? Why do you exist? And so I see that in everyone that I meet. And if I'm tasked with having an interesting conversation with someone, I'm gonna really try to listen and understand where they're coming from, and having it's less of an interview and more of a conversation. That's kind of my approach. And I think people can see that in the work.
Yeah, I think you bring up a very interesting point about this issue of empathy and listening, which I think is one of the things that's very important and that documentary filmmakers do well. And there is a difference between a documentary style of interview and a journalist style of interview. Obviously there are journalists who do our kind of interviews as well, but you kind of saw it in Spotlight, which I thought was very revealing, is these, and very accurate, that, it was being reenacted, obviously, but you had these journalists interviewing people about very important subjects, talking about the most intimate part of their lives, and they keep a distance. And that's what they're trained to do. And, I really respect that kind of training. But what we do is different. There is an empathy. The reality is that we are invested in these people. They are invested in us for years. And that's all kind of comes into the interview process. And so, I have to say that, I work with Amy Ziering, my co-director, and she does nearly all the interviews. And so she develops this very empathetic, safe space where people can say whatever they like. They can, if they say something they feel like I don't want that said, they can say, no, I can, please don't include that. They have this entire range of what to do. And one of the reasons I work with her is she's so, expert at that. One last thing I'd like to say is, obviously verite footage, verite filmmaking is wonderful. It's completely seductive. But, I really think, conducting an interview and cutting an interview in some ways is even harder certainly than cutting verite footage. I mean, there's something about there's a real art to that. And sometimes I think it's given short shrift. It's like considered not the same level. And I don't think that's true. I mean, I think what's going on between an interviewer and interviewee in a documentary film, both in the actual interview and then in the cutting process, is a very profound and rich and complex process that is completely at the level of verite filmmaking and cutting.
I really agree with that. And I think it's important to point out this. It is a conversation born of real curiosity and interest in really understanding. I think like we're not about the gotcha, but more about understanding. And I think too, the other piece of it is finding and creating the environment in which your subject feels comfortable enough to access their story and to say what they want to say. Like I always say to people, this is your interview. It's not my interview. It's my job to help you explain whatever it is you really want to say. So it's one of my favorite things to do. And like when it goes well, there's like a cadence to an interview where you start and people are a little nervous, you settle into it. And at some point something clicks where the person is really, they understand that they have all the time in the world and that they can figure out how to say what they want. And then I'm going to give them the space to say what they want to say. And I think that's also like, it's important. We show our emotions in interviews, like one of the most influential things that's ever happened to me in interviewing is my first film, Gideon's Army, and this young public defender was explaining how a client that she loved and she worked really hard for had threatened to kill her. And she found out about it from other people in the jail. And she starts crying and I start crying. It's my first film. So, but the DP, who was really empathetic and great, like I feel him put his hand on my shoulder and pull me back, because my instinct was to comfort her and to interrupt her. And he's like, no, you gotta let this go. So that's hard to figure out. How do you remain a person while you're accessing this information? You really have to have the trust going. The last thing I'll say is with people who are well known, they are often coached about what to say and how to say it. And the result of that is they feel insecure about their own words. And so explaining to them, I don't want your standard, your PR person coached you through things. So I had the experience recently of interviewing a sports star, and he told this really deep story. And I was like, I've never heard that before. And he said, no one's ever asked me. So I think it's really important, particularly for well-known people. They want you to treat them like people, not about not like a basketball star or a musician or whatever. People are people, and figuring out how to, communicate that you see them as people and not their career or the thing that they're famous for. That's really important too.
Yeah, I would also say too that, when you're working with people who have experienced a lot of trauma and a lot of marginalization and oppression around what you're speaking about, that trust actually is needed at a much higher level. And that I would even go further, that sometimes there needs to be a contract. You need to know my intentions with what I'm going to do. and how I'm going to kind of put this story out there. Because, you know, I had a subject tell me once that was profoundly impactful on me, which is, she said to me, Angela, I'll tell you my story, but I want you to do something with it. And so I'm not going to excavate this pain. I'm not going to excavate this trauma unless I know that I feel confident you're going to do something to transform that with what you create. And that contract is really important for those conditions, I think.
I'd like to, if you don't mind, pick up on the question that Allison asked and ask another question that's related to this. In that, coming back to the beginning, which has to do with that inherent tension between those two legs of documentary, or two roots, or two parents, I use different descriptions, which is journalism and art. And I come from a journalism background, and I hear, Sasha, you also come from a journalism background. And of course, part of that tension is the difference between being all in for intimacy and maintaining a certain kind of distance and a certain level of perceived objectivity, for lack of a better word. And so I think I'd like to hear how our other panelists deal with that. I think when we're talking about, everyone was talking about, of course, listening and empathy and all those things. And it's obvious when you nail it from the way your interviews turn out. But in one sense, I think it's one thing to be listening and empathetic, say, to a victim of sexual assault in universities, as you know, as Kirby had to do. What happens when you go to the other side? What happens when you interview the person who represents something that is in complete opposition to what you believe in and probably what the film is going to be about? Do you try to create that intimacy, and is it fake in a way to try to draw them out? And I'm just curious how all of you balance that other side and that tension between, again, journalism and art.
I think the approach is similar. I think the difference is, if you know going in that you disagree with somebody's philosophy, it's important not to pretend that you are sympathetic to it. So, you know, I once interviewed the lead of the White Citizens Council in Mississippi. Under no circumstances did he believe I was for segregation. And what I think worked in that interview was, I actually really was curious about what motivated him. He, you know, and I said to him at one point, I said, Mr. Harned, we are having a respectful conversation. I said, it's really hard for someone my age to understand why segregation was so important to you, why, you know, the presence of Black people scared you, or what, or how, use it in your words. And he said to me, segregation was tradition, and we like tradition in Mississippi. And I think, you know, like, that's the best he could do, because he also at some level knew there wasn't any rational reason to be afraid of people. So he wasn't a Klan member, he wasn't that, but he was a racist, and he was part of a governmental system that tried to enforce segregation. So I think it's like part of the honesty. If the person accepts the interview, you know, like, I'm not Borat, like, I'm not like trying to trick people into saying undercover stuff. But I think that there is a way to be respectful, even when you deeply disagree, you know, and there's a way to challenge. There's also a way to challenge the subjects that you agree with, you know, philosophically. You have to be able to ask those hard questions too, because or else then you just become an activist. And then if you ignore the harder parts of the story, then there's something that's missing that the audience knows is missing, mostly because they can Google and find it, but also because you all know it's missing.
But let's go back even further. How do you even get them to trust you enough to agree to doing an interview with you when they probably have Googled your work and have an idea of, what sort of point of view you might have.
Well, I think people, especially now, want to be heard, especially if they're on the opposite side of the fence. And I don't go into it with an empathetic ear. I go into it with a very straight, ask the question straight and engage, and as I hear the answer, things that pique my interest, I ask the question. There was a film I did with 50 Cent, who oddly just endorsed Trump, but that's a whole other conversation. And it was about reconnecting with his ancestry in South Carolina. And we wound up finding the folks who owned his folks, and those folks still own the plantation. And he had a great aunt who still lived there and had driven by this house a million times and had no idea that her family had this history. And so there's a museum there dedicated to an organization called the Red Shirts. Who are the Red Shirts? They are the precursor to the Klan. And this totally fine, nice enough older, white woman was giving 50 Cent a tour, giving us a tour of the property. And, they had all these tributes to these red shirts who were racists. And slavery came up and she said, oh, the slaves were treated completely fine. They were like family. And 50 Cent is dumbfounded. So I said to him, I'm being Cyrano in the situation. I said, ask her how she knows that. So 50 Cent says, well, how do you know that? And she's like, well, I knew one of the slaves. And I'm like, and many of them came from Mongolia. And I'm like, let her talk. Just let her talk. So she talked about Mongolian slaves and she talked about knowing slaves, which was not physically possible. But it was a totally fine conversation and she put it out there. There was no reason for me to judge her. When she said something I didn't understand or didn't make sense, I would say, are you sure? And it was what it was. But I don't go into any of these situations. I'm very straight with folks that I might not agree with because I want everything to be clear and I want them to feel like they're getting the respect that they deserve. Oddly enough, they might not deserve it, but journalistically, they deserve that respect. And so I'm very straight with my questions.
I mean, I would add to that. I think people, engage in news with us because, you approach them and you say, we really want to hear your side of the story. But for me, I think, it's important to keep in mind that these people have been able to tell their story in the broadest possible way. They have the power. And so I think, I certainly feel that I have an obligation to do this interview in such a way that it gets beyond the PR front that they've been able to put out for decades. And so, I mean, we certainly do an incredible amount of preparation to see how they've responded to every question, to see where there may be angles in to get a more truer perspective on what's really going on. And but at the same time, like Sasha says, I mean, it's a respectful interview. I mean, there's a warmth there. They've chosen to do this, but I feel a responsibility to the audience and to the country, really, to ask these questions that are very rarely asked of them, and ask them in a way that sort of gets beyond the facade that they're going to put forward. And so, I mean, it's I wouldn't say it's a tense experience, but it's a very challenging experience. I mean, you're in this situation where they're so expert at pairing everything that you've got to find a way around to get deeper into the truth.
We are nearing our end of our time here with each other at the end of this hour. And I wanted to just put out one last question, if you could briefly entertain that for the whole panel. And that is, we are going under an incredible amount of shift in our culture and our society around pandemics and protests and social upheaval and the thing about this moment is that things become upended and they reshuffle and they reorganize in ways. Historically, that's what pandemics have done. Historically, social crisis produces these kinds of moments. And this impacts all industries. They have to rethink who they are. They have to rethink how they do business. So my question is, how is this moment reshaping how you do your work, how you work with others, how the possibilities, I think, is what I'm really interested in, although we're all really, really aware of the constraints. Do you see any possibilities in this moment and how it might be shifting storytelling? Like, I'm starting to think about cross-platform storytelling. That's micro storytelling. That seems to be where a lot of people want to kind of think about storytelling in different ways. And so I'm wondering how you all see this moment and what you see in front of you.
Well, I'm finishing a film about Rick James for Showtime, and there are a few interviews I needed to do that were in California. So we got creative, you know, there are folks with hazmat suits who operate cameras and sound, and we secured the talent and they set up the cameras. I approved the shot, and I'm sitting right now is where I conducted my interview. And I was able to look the subject in the eye, and I think I got a fairly competitive conversation going, you know, on par with what I would have gotten in person. I mean, there's a big difference, of course, but considering the circumstances, I felt like, thankfully, most of the film was in the can, but for what I needed to do, it felt good, and I felt like I got what I needed. You know, how is that going to evolve? We'll see. I mean, you know, it feels like folks are adapting and people are working again and finding creative ways to do it. You just have to be extremely careful and cautious. And I hear now in Los Angeles, there are folks who are on set whose job it is, you know, on behalf of the state or whatever, to make sure that people are following protocols. So that's probably where we're going until things change. But it's possible. Things are happening.
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, you know, we're very careful when we do these interviews. I mean, we tend to now to work a great deal in studios with green screen. You shoot, and there's an hour in between where you can air it out. We try to, you know, we have a DP and a production coordinator that travel together, so in a sense they're a pod, and they really do everything, sound, everything else. And so, you know, we limit exposure, and then we do the interviews remotely. And so far, it has worked out very well. I mean, it is a huge responsibility, because oftentimes you're interviewing people who are accomplished, and those people are, you know, in their 50s, 60s, 70s, so they're at greater risk. But we've really tried to lessen the risk as much as possible.
I think too, you know, documentary filmmaking is always hard. There's always some challenge to every movie. So I think it's even harder now. So I think it's like incumbent upon all of us to be even more judicious with our choices. Like, it's really got to be worth it to make a film, both like to have something to say and to, there's no situation without risk, right? So, you know, I wouldn't say, is this worth it? But I am thinking in choices about both my time and like what I'm asking my collaborators to do. You know, the calculus is probably even more, you know, acute to really, I don't think I just jump into things and say, oh, how's this going to be? Like, you really have to have a lot more care of forethought before starting something, because it's going to be harder, you know, for the next year. We're probably, this is probably like what we got, you know.
When we're talking about this particular moment, I'd like to shift that just a little, rather than focusing on the pandemic. What I wonder about is this moment in terms of media and where we're at. And what I wonder about is, can a 1 hour or a 2 hour standalone single documentary film on a social issue really have the kind of impact that it had 10, 20, 30 years ago, in the world of TikTok, in the world of YouTube? and in the world of 10-part series.
Yeah, I feel like it can. I feel like it's like even more urgent to have those films because those films are considered, like I find like there's actually kind of a longing for a not screaming at each other, not hot take, kind of something you can sink into. And I think that that's what we do, and not doing 10 parts, like there's there's that's the work, is like, no offense everybody, but everybody could do 10 parts, like you just don't edit it very well. And you just say every single thing you thought, and you let your mother talk about what a good baby you were, like you just like doing
Eyes on the Prize might be the only exception, maybe. There's a lot to cover there in Eyes on the Prize.
I think the 10 parts now, and it's just it's a different animal, it's a different exercise, and I think that the restraint is really valuable to me, and having to make those decisions.
Well, on behalf of the Ebert Symposium and the University of Illinois, thank you for your time and your appreciation. I mean, what you provided today was amazing. Thank you.
Thanks for a great conversation.
Yeah, thank you. It was wonderful, actually.
Yep.
Very wonderful.
Yeah, it was a real honor to meet all of you. Thank you so much. Your films have provided a lot of hope. So thank you for all of your
Keep doing all the good work.
Thank you.